Now, the rollout of the next stage of universal credit is set to be postponed due to concerns about the controversial benefit system. In the next few weeks, ministers were due to seek parliamentary approval to move 3 million existing welfare claimants onto the new benefit. But now, Work and Pension Secretary Amber Rudd will seek approval for just 10,000 people to be moved onto the system in the summer. Well, I'm joined now by one of the architects of universal credit and Director of Policy in Practice, Devon Ghelani. Thanks very much for being with us on Sky News this afternoon. So 3 million people were due to be moved over. Now it's only 10,000. Why?
Well, I think it's sensible. I think there are enough concerns about the rollout of universal credit, particularly its impact on those on the lowest incomes, to make sure that, for the DWP, to make sure that it gets the delivery of universal credit absolutely right for this critical cohort. It's probably worth making sure that your viewers are aware that if they were to be made unemployed, or if they're on benefits and their circumstances change, they will still move on to universal credit. So there will still be around 3 million people on universal credit by the end of this year. So it still is going to affect quite a lot of people this year, despite this scaling back.
Is this just another example of how the government have completely bungled the implementation of universal credit?
I think it's a good example of a new Secretary of State taking on board the feedback that she's hearing and not rushing in and just trusting that everything's going to be okay. I think it makes a lot of sense for her to make sure that she gets the absolute details of this right. And I think one of the strengths of scaling back to 10,000 people is that almost case by case, each one of those individuals on their journey through universal credit can be properly examined to make sure that people, when they move on to universal credit, get absolutely the best experience possible. I think there'll be some cynicism around DWP's ability to deliver that at scale. But I think just given the history of universal credit, but I think there have been some improvements announced to universal credit, some additional investment into universal credit, and I think the real question is, do those changes go far enough?
Yeah, you say many people might welcome the government perhaps taking its foot off the pedal slightly, but the rollout's run over budget, it's years behind schedule, it's been criticised for making an estimated 3 million households worse off. Critics will say they ran into this too quickly in the first place. It's all very well slowing things down now, but this should have happened months, years ago.
I agree that particularly some of the more recent improvements and additional investment into universal credit, I think that should have been in place really from the outset back in 2013. I think we've got to remember that universal credit is being introduced in the context of a whole range of other changes to the benefit system, which have fundamentally made it more generous. What that means is that I think some of the challenges that people are facing on universal credit are challenges that they would be facing under the legacy system, given the sort of money that's been taken out of it. And I think the message to the government has got to be that you can't reform the welfare system on the cheap. These are the lowest income families in the country, and the people we work with on the front line recognise that the budgets of the people that they're working with are being stretched to the very limit, regardless of whether they're still on the legacy system or on universal credit. And they need to have the capacity to be able to manage any changes that are expected. The benefit system changing does affect their finances, and they need to have some extra bandwidth and extra capacity. Some of the money going into universal credit more recently should help that a little bit. I think, as I said earlier, the question is, does that go far enough?
You've been someone who has had to claim benefits yourself. You've obviously been heavily involved in the implementation of universal credit. What about those 3 million people who were expecting to go on to universal credit in the summer? You've touched on this already, but what will this mean for them personally?
I think there's a group that the DWP are rightly very concerned about. Those are the people that have been on benefits for some time. Their circumstances haven't changed. Currently, what's happened within the legacy system is that they're not really seen. They just continue to receive the money, and maybe that's absolutely the right thing for them. What moving on to universal credit is going to do is going to force them to. It just means that they're going to have to provide new evidence, new information, and although there's transitional protection in place, the amount of money that they're going to get will ultimately change over time. And the support needs to be available to those families to be able to manage those changes, manage the move on to universal credit, manage the change in their finances, so that it's, from my perspective, having been involved in universal credit from the outset and having claimed benefits a long time ago, I think the experience of claiming benefits needs to feel much more customer centric, if you will. It needs to be actually about the person that's there claiming the benefits. The benefit system is there fundamentally to help people, first of all, get the social security support that they're eligible for, and also give them the support they need to take steps toward independence. And I think sometimes universal credit, but also the benefit system generally, has expected quite a lot of people without necessarily always making sure there's the support, the right level of support around them for them to manage that change. If the support
You must be very depressed, having been part of universal credit from the start. When you hear stories about people who are reliant on food banks, who've been forced into destitution, even prostitution in certain cases. I see that Labour's Frank Field, Work and Pensions Select Committee Chairman, has said today that universal credit was a human catastrophe waiting to happen under its ill-formed plans for moving people onto universal credit. For anyone who was part of that, designing that system, it must be very depressing that all these months, all these years later, we still can't get it right.
Yeah, I think part of the driver of setting up policy and practice is, as the name says, to see what happens to a good policy idea when it's implemented in practice. As I said, some of the context around universal credit is a less generous benefit system. I think there are definitely improvements to universal credit that need to be made, and policy and practice writes about those. They're informed by the work we do on the front line with advisors. I'm fundamentally an optimistic person in the sense that I think the legacy benefit system absolutely needed to improve, needed to change, and tinkering with that wasn't always going to be the right way to go. I'm optimistic that the DWP and particularly Amber Rudd, she seems to be listening. She seems to be taking a lot of the right steps. Are going to get this right. My message fundamentally to government is that probably isn't going to happen if you continue to try and take money out of the welfare system, try and put more pressure on the finances of the lowest income families in the country. And you need to invest in universal credit to get it right. It is a reform for the long term, and trying to do long term reforms on the cheap very rarely works out in any sphere.
OK, Devon Ghelani, Director of Policy in Practice, one of the architects as well of universal credit. Thank you.
Thank you.